Hey, cuties. This is The Dark Side of Perfect. I'm your host, Maggie, and today we are going to be talking about perception and validation. More specifically, being perceived as imperfect and defining achievement and accomplishment and how validation fits into that. We've got a lot to unpack with this one, so let's talk about it. As perfect girls, it's hard to know who you are. It's hard to think, okay, I know what I should be doing, but what do I want to be doing? How do I find who I am? And what that comes from is two defining questions, which is what we will talk about throughout this entire episode and come back to at the end. And those are, who am I if no one is watching? And if no one is going to know about it, who am I without perception being an option? And who am I without the validation for my accomplishments? Or, as us perfect girls would put it, who am I without accomplishment? For someone who constantly chases the validation and constantly thinks, what will people think of me? How will this be perceived? I don't like being perceived. It can be so unsettling to think about those questions and honestly to not know the answer, but then to think about them deeper and think about the way I just said it, that who am I without the validation of accomplishment? Or as we would put it, who am I without accomplishment? Because for us perfect girls who search for that validation, whether it be academic, from a parent, from peers, wanting to fit in, whatever, those are the same thing. If we don't get validation and move forward in our life because of our accomplishments, then we don't really consider it an accomplishment. Many of us built our identity around performance, praise, and productivity. That is normal. And that is what our culture pushes us to be, pushes us to think, pushes us to form our identity around. And it's impossible for us to willy nilly out of the blue detach ourselves from that identity and find who we are when no one is watching and who we are without accomplishment. In this episode, first I'm going to define perception and how it shapes us, how it influences that identity. And then I'm going to talk about validation and how that influences our identity. And then I'm going to talk about how we can loosen the grip of perception and cultivate internal validation. So, how we can sort of shift our mindset to become less aware of perception and create our own validation so that our accomplishments are accomplishments regardless of if someone tells us that we did a good job or not, or that we're moving forward in our life or not, or if we're fitting into the should trap mold or not. I'm going to have some examples in this episode that might feel a little bit negative and like I'm discrediting perception and validation. But I want to make it very clear upfront I am not. Perception and validation are always going to be a part of our lives. They're heavy influencers in our lives, they're a cultural influence in our lives, and they give us the dopamine and the good fuzzy feelings that we need to have. They can also give us negative feelings. And I think that in this episode, I'm just coming from a standpoint of trying to figure out how to get past the barrier of perception and validation without discrediting them and getting rid of them entirely. So, first, let's define perception and its power. So, what is it baseline? It's how we believe others see us. But more importantly, it's how we imagine ourselves through their eyes. So, how we think they're looking at us, what we think we look like, what we think we sound like, if we have the perfect signature scent, if we have the perfect colors on in our color palette, if our hair is perfectly done, how we imagine they are looking at us. And when we like the image that we see through someone else's eyes, that becomes safety, belonging, and worth. And we care about that because social belonging equals emotional safety. And social rejection actually activates the same area of your brain as physical pain. So if you don't like the image that you think that they're seeing, then you want to coil into yourself. You want to pull back. You want to maybe isolate yourself. You maybe want to pick out and circle all of the parts of you that you wish that you could change and try to change those things about you because you don't like the way that you think someone else is looking at you. So with this, The perception becomes a compass for behavior and a filter for your decision making. So we stop asking, what do I want? And instead we think, will this be well received? We make our decisions based on the idea that it will be well received and that the image that we think others are seeing is positive. So, how perception influences our identity. I think it's easy to confuse the perception anxiety with validation anxiety because I think that perception rarely leads to anxiety and more leads to self editing. So, when you're thinking about how that person is looking at you, the validation aspect, will they accept me, is more anxiety inducing than the perception of it, where you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to change things about myself. So, when I think of perception, I think of, in one of my previous episodes, I talked about this image of a little girl that you used to be and how that little girl grew up and fell into the should trap and was doing everything right. From that little girl stage, when you're building the life that you think that you should have, you create this image of yourself, of your life, of your relationships, your career, where you should be by a certain point in your life. You have this image and you look at it, and it's a goal, but more importantly, it controls some of the decisions that you make. You have two options as a perfect girl to get to this ideal scenario and end goal. One is to choose the next steps in pursuit of that image without question. You choose what makes sense, what sounds good, what feels explainable to other people. You do a scan of what will land well, what will look impressive, what will look responsible, what will make you more stable in someone else's eyes, at the cost of aliveness, creativity, self trust. Or two, you can do what makes you happy and choose without thinking. But the cost of that is that you feel guilty, lost, behind, and oftentimes isolated. So over time, perception filters your choices around career, relationships, hobbies, personality expression, and emotional openness. And as perfect girls, we feel disconnected from ourselves, restless, bored, apathetic, and don't even know what we enjoy because we're chasing this image of what we should be doing. And maybe there are parts of that image that you really like. There are parts of my image that I really like. But at the same time, there are parts that I don't. And if I think too much about it, about making choices in pursuit of that goal, then it makes me feel restless and apathetic because there's no way that the parts that I don't want out of that image are ever going to make me happy. And I have to recognize that. Identity confusion. So, not knowing who you are, not knowing what you want, not knowing what you enjoy, not knowing what hobbies you even want to go back to. When everyone says, go back to what you did when you were a kid. What if I don't even know what I did? What if I didn't even like what I did? What if I buy yarn to crochet and I hate it? That could happen. But it's a matter of experimentation. And identity confusion is where desire is filtered through perception. So, are you crocheting because it's the hot hobby to have right now? Or are you crocheting because it's actually something that you enjoy doing? Will it look good and make sense and land well that you're crocheting? Or is it something you do without thinking? You want to make a pillow, so you just do it. And no one needs to know that you made a pillow, but when people come over, they'll see it and it'll be cute, or it won't, and you'll hide it because you care about the perception of other people, even when it's at the cost of your emotional openness and personality expression. Just to sum up this part, because I know it was a lot to take in, perception influences identity by creating a picture that you give yourself permission to want. And even if that picture changes, if it's not in pursuit of actual happiness and joy and personality expression, then it isn't what you want. And living for the idea of other people influences your identity from day one on this earth. What we're trying to do here is not shut out perception entirely, not stop caring what people think of you, not, have people perceive you differently or more whimsical or more free, but to help you make choices in pursuit of what you want and thinking about what people say about it later, after the fact, after you've already made the decision in pursuit of what makes you happy and what you want. Now that I've got you thinking about perception, let's move on to validation. So, what this is the external confirmation that we are worthy. So, this can come from places like achievement, praise, recognition, moral goodness, and appearance. As perfect girls, we want to fit in and feel safe. And we know that achievement equals safety and praise equals love. And I'm not talking just about parents, but also culture, peers, teachers, your neighbor, whatever. The HOA, like if you have a perfect lawn and they never give you a citation, but all of your neighbors have citations, then you feel a little bit of that dopamine, a little bit of that, wow, I'm safe. I achieved that gold star for me. Or same thing as like if you're in a workout class and they adjust the person next to you, but not your form. And then you're like, am I better than everyone? Because even though it's not direct, that's still validation. And I'm not saying that that's bad. Sometimes you do feel that way, and sometimes it's good to get that validation. What I'm talking about here is having the validation be your emotional fuel, your motivation, your identity. And it's easy to fall into validation being your identity and forever trying to make people proud of you and trying to make them feel happy for something that you did and trying to justify your existence constantly through external validation because validation increases dopamine and it has these reinforcement loops, so you get wired to chase approval constantly. Without validation, there is silence, and that silence feels a lot like disappointment. And as a perfect girl myself, disappointing someone is gut-wrenching, disheartening, an attack on my identity and who I am as a person because I feel like I've let someone else down. So when I do something wrong or when I do something, not totally right, or when I feel like I do something right but they don't say anything, then I feel not good enough. My identity is tied to the validation that I get from doing something, the achievement that I feel from completing a task or a project or whatever is directly tied to the validation that I get from someone else to feel like I actually accomplished something. So, how it shapes our identity. When we seek validation and permission, eventually it will become your identity. The image from perception, that image of what you want to be, that what you're striving to based on the should trap, or even if it's changing now that you're kind of thinking about what you want. The image from perception is what you gave yourself permission to want. And it's our identity because we don't know who we are without it. If you're looking at the image of your eventual goal, the should trap, what your end life line should look like, that is what you gave yourself permission to want. And that is what others have validated for years that you should be wanting. So you look at that image and you notice that parts of it are fuzzy and parts of it are things that you're like, I don't like that. But because it's so tied to our identity, if we get rid of the image, or if we get rid of parts of the image, or if we pluck out a small part of the image and replace it with something else, then it looks like it doesn't quite fit because we haven't been given that validation to change that part of the image. And so then we don't know who we are. Because if we change a part of the image, then we no longer feel like we are going to be accepted. When this happens, we feel lost and flat and like we aren't able to express ourselves. And this is where that anxiety comes in. Because then you're thinking, if I do change, then perception, validation, my identity, it's going to crumble. It's going to fall apart into a million tiny little pieces all over the ground, and someone else is going to have to clean that up. And as a perfect girl, I can't allow that. I'm going to be the one with the broom and the dustpan, and I'm going to have to sweep up the broken parts of myself because I wanted to change a part of this image. And maybe that's not acceptable to me. Maybe I don't want to clean up the parts of myself. Maybe I just want to keep with the image and feel lost and flat. And that causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of pain and a lot of internal conflict. Achievement and validation become worth. And without it, we feel invisible and like we should do more or do different to feel proud and justify ourselves so that we can hold all of those cracks together with glue instead of falling apart on the ground and just use that glue as justification that we are keeping it together even when we have anxiety and we know that any moment we're going to fall apart. Keeping that glue, reapplying it, keeping yourself together when you know it's not what you want for the purpose of validation and perception is going to lead to burnout, overfunctioning, and chronic dissatisfaction. And the real truth of the matter, the real hard part about this whole podcast is at some point, you have to realize that the cracks are not manageable and that you're going to fall apart. But once you sweep yourself up, it'll be easier to put yourself back together. It'll be hard at first, but once you know what you want, then you'll know how to do it again. You'll know how to change again for what you want in the future. So, how do we loosen the grip of perception and cultivate internal validation so that we don't feel like our identity is as tied to these two things as it is right now? I've broken it down into 5 parts, and I really think that perception and validation go hand in hand and that they're often talked about as different things. Well, I'm perceived this way, I'm getting validation, but I really think that they are one and the same. And the reason that we split them up into these two different areas is just to make it harder on ourselves to detach them from our identity. But if you think of them as one thing or as a step ladder of perception, then validation, then happiness, if you think of them like that, it's easier to detach your identity from them because that's where the problem comes in. Always thinking about perception, always going after validation, always trying to make others proud of you and never feeling proud of yourself, that's where the problem comes in. So I've split this into 5 different parts, and I'm going to talk about each of them and give some reflective questions around them. So, part 1 is becoming aware of perception and validation loops. So, this is just like we've talked about in every other episode. It's starting with noticing when perception is driving decisions and when validation is motivating action. So, some guiding questions to ask yourself to kind of find this awareness is, if no one knew I was doing this, would I still want to? And I find it actually that question is not always yes or no. Sometimes it's I don't know. And so you have to do it and see if the outcome of the perception is why you did it. So sometimes it takes some experimentation to figure out if you would still want to do it, because as I said, it's hard to know if what you want or what you want to do without the perception of it. So do it, and then if the validation, if the perception is really the reason that you did it, if you're like, oh, people will come over and see this pillow I made and that will be so cute, then maybe you did it for perception. And maybe there's another hobby out there that you can do for you. Another one is, if awareness or if approval wasn't available, would I still choose to do this? And then the most important question is, does doing this deplete me? Does crocheting a pillow for your couch actually not bring you any joy as you're actively crocheting? I mean, obviously, crocheting is a little bit frustrating sometimes, but as you're making the pillow and as you're learning the steps and as you're towards the end and stuffing the pillow and then you close it up, do you feel an immense amount of joy having made that pillow? Or are you like, the only way I would ever make that pillow again is if someone asked me to do it? Does it deplete you? And if the answer is yes, if it does deplete you, then maybe that wasn't for you. And maybe you were doing it for the perception and the validation, and that was guiding your decisions. Part 1 is an observable part. So it can be hard and you might not know. So it's important to use part 1 continuously as you use the other parts as constant observation to identify it and to identify what you're doing for perception and validation in order to recognize those loops. Part 2 is practicing safe imperfection. I have a lot of friends who tell me that they hate being perceived and that being perceived imperfectly or not up to their expectations is worse than anything. And then they'll go hide in a hole and rot and sit in the dark until they can find perfection again. So, part 2 is about practicing safe imperfection so that eventually, as you do get perceived, as everyone does, then you can be fine being perceived imperfectly. So, this is building self safety through being slightly less polished, slightly misunderstood, and building a tolerance for discomfort and ambiguity and neutral reactions instead of ecstatic ones. So, this is about like doing things 75% and allow yourself to take things at a slow pace, maybe not control every aspect of something. It's about letting the messiness of life linger and learn that nothing bad will happen if you are not constantly exceptional. It's about maybe instead of taking 15 calls a day, you take 5 for work and you just do it slowly. You have a bit more time in between and not controlling every aspect. If there's a slight little error on a slide, maybe you leave it because maybe only you're noticing it. Part 3 is a shift towards internal validation. So this is not forced confidence, although fake it till you make it is a good skill that I do recommend people do because eventually then you'll be it. But it's not about forcing the confidence. It's not about putting affirmations on your mirror, even though I also think that that is a good way to sometimes hear the things that you can't tell yourself is through affirmations. But the shift towards the internal validation is not about the forced confidence, not about the affirmations. And it's not about toxic positivity. It's about witnessing yourself and finding good things and why it's important to you. So it's looking at the things that you're doing, objectively seeing how you get through the day and recognizing the good even in the bad moments, the silver linings, and then actively pointing out why those things are important to you and why they're good. So something like this podcast, for example. This podcast has a lot of aspects about it that are difficult and take more work than I was expecting. And I recognize that, not everyone does a podcast for a reason. And it is hard, but I am proud of myself for trying and for taking that step to do this podcast. Something smaller might be trying to make sourdough for the first time. Sourdough is hard and it takes some experimentation, and not everyone does it for a reason. And that was hard, but if you did it, I'm proud of you for trying. I'm proud of you for going after it. That could be true of running a 5K to cleaning your house when you're not feeling it, or, you can do hard things. Another good thing that could come out of things is this matters to me even if no one sees it. I have a lot of hobbies. I do a lot of different things, and those things matter to me even if I never move forward with them. Writing my little essays that I like to write, that's just for me. No one sees them, but it matters to me even if no one sees it, that I find some time in my week to do a little bit of writing on my essays or journaling or whatever I'm doing. And there could be pressure to put those things on Substack or to monetize your hobbies. But your hobbies, the things that you like doing, they can matter even if you don't monetize them, and even if they're not what is culturally considered productive. Then there's I'm allowed to rest without earning it. So maybe if you're feeling really down one day, really not into it, and you allow yourself to have productive rest where you maybe do some meditative breathing and you make a drink that is one of your favorites and you drink it very slowly and you do the things that you need to do to make yourself feel better and do that active rest. Take a dark shower, take a bath. You allowed yourself to rest and you didn't have to justify that rest to yourself. You just did it because you knew that it was the natural rhythm of your life. And on that, I like to say to myself, I am allowed to follow my natural rhythms without justification. If I'm feeling very tired, I'll go on a walk because I know that it gives me energy. If I'm feeling like crashing, I'll drink a soda because it'll give me that little dopamine hit without doom scrolling. If, I don't know, following your natural rhythms, I'll be creative in the morning because that's when I'm most creative. I'll write an essay or do some reading in the evening because that's when I'm most reflective. I'm allowed to follow my natural rhythms without justification. So shifting towards this internal validation of witnessing the things that you do, witnessing parts of yourself, witnessing your natural rhythms, and then finding the good in it and expressing why it's important to you is part 3. Part 4, building internal safety. So this is about noticing feelings without fixing them and actually letting yourself be calm long enough to feel what you're feeling, letting yourself not be distracted by external stimuli long enough to feel what you're feeling. And I know that that's incredibly scary, but you have to feel what you're feeling in order to move on. It's just the truth. It's what therapy is all about. You have to feel things in order to address them and move on. And you don't need to fix your feelings, but noticing them is the first step. Building internal safety is about curiosity for yourself, feeling over judgment and suppression, and then observing that feeling, sitting with it over active, constant correction. And by constant correction, I mean judging yourself for feeling angry or sad or happy and suppressing that feeling as soon as you feel it so that you don't have to and you can move on to the next thing. That's constant correction. And I'm not saying you constantly have to sit in your feelings, but you also can't constantly correct for your feelings. There has to be a balance. Have some time where you just do some breathing and you sit in your feelings. Maybe you let a tear loose, maybe you laugh. Feel what you're feeling. And then there are other times where you need to suppress your feelings for a couple of minutes so that you can get through what you're getting through, and then afterwards you can feel it. When I was in grad school, we had this program for women in business, and it was really not for me. Basically, we tell this story, and other people then tell their story about something relevant that's supposed to give you advice without directly giving you advice. I was doing something very important to me in grad school, and so I told a story about how I was doing this thing that was very important to me, but I was feeling like I was putting too much work into it and, it was taking away from other parts of my life. But it was very important that I keep doing it and that I really enjoyed doing it. And there were aspects that I really loved. And the only aspect that I couldn't do was setting boundaries against it because it was the most important thing. And so it was hard for me to give time to less important things. And every story that they came back with was about how they have had leaders in the past who were bad leaders and how those leaders didn't know how to delegate and didn't know how to find self-care and didn't know how to be a good leader and took everything for themselves and then took all of the credit, and how they were basically pieces of shit who, were overlords. And I felt horrible after these stories because I thought that nothing in my story led to me thinking that I was a bad leader, because I didn't think I was a bad leader. I just thought that I was having trouble time managing such an important event with other things in my life. And so I had to keep myself together while on camera. I was angry, I was hurt, I was 3 inches from sobbing. And so I had to suppress my feelings during that call and not say anything because they weren't doing it on purpose. And I was taking it very personally. And then after the call, I hung up and I cried for a good long time, questioning my life choices, questioning if the story that I told really did evoke those kinds of poor leadership qualities that they were talking about. And I came to the conclusion that my story did not. And so then I sent a email to the organizer saying that I was dropping out of the club, which I thought was the right decision for me. But the point is, I had that correction in the moment because I needed to get through it. And then afterwards, I let myself sit, I let myself reflect, and I let myself act. But that's the order you have to do it. You have to sit, you have to reflect, and then you can act. But you need to take a minute. I was talking to my mom the other day about my boundary setting episode that I'm going to make and how we talk about things that happened in my childhood. And she was saying that sometimes as humans, we overreact in the moment, and then you reflect and then you can come back and say what you really meant to say. But that there's always that in the moment overreaction to some negative thing. And yeah, that happens, especially if you let yourself constantly suppress your emotions and then something very negative happens. In that meeting, I very easily could have spoken up and said, I really don't appreciate what you all are insinuating, and I didn't say that in my story, and this is really hurting my feelings right now, and I'm dropping out of the club, and I hate all of you. I could have said something like that, but I didn't. I sat there and I let myself feel what I was feeling before I acted. But if I did do that in the meeting, then I would have then sat in the feeling of regret and reflected on that and then acted appropriately to correct my overreaction. Basically, building internal safety is doing the work to deal with your trauma, but realizing that tamping down things all the time is exhausting and will only lead to boiling over. So it's the internal safety to be able to feel your feelings. Safety being approval is no longer required for emotional survival. You don't need approval. You need to just feel whatever you're feeling and then act appropriately. Part 5, replacing performance with presence. My previous episode was about performance and romanticizing your life. But what this part is shifting your identity from performer to participant. So instead of thinking what other people see when they look at you and then performing appropriately so that they give you their approval, you're instead a participant in your own life. You're being who you are without justification, without output, without proof of who you should be. And then over time, self-trust will replace the approval. Desire will replace the perception, and peace will push out performance. So once you do all the work to feel your feelings and find that internal validation, practice safe imperfection, then eventually you can give yourself approval and find accomplishment within the things that you do without someone else having to see it. And then you can desire things for yourself and you can find peace and self without the performance. Tying back to our original questions, which are who am I without achievement and who am I when no one is watching? You are still someone. You are a person worthy of love, full of ambition, powerful, whimsical, all of the things that you want to be and that you know that you are, even when you are resting, uncertain, unfinished, and unpolished. I think that we think about ambition and power as the opposite of resting and uncertainty, but that is not true. You can take things slowly and still be ambitious. You can take things at your own pace and still be powerful. You can go about life with internal validation and still find all of the output that you want and feel like you should have. Even if you have 100 different interests and none are your main one, and most don't make money or serve some sort of perceived purpose, you are still ambitious and powerful. Me saying this, sitting here behind this mic, means nothing. The person that you need permission and validation of existence from is you, not me, not your mom, not your dad, not your grandparents, not your professors, not your best friend, you. The only person who can tell you that you are full of ambition and power and love and whimsy, even when you are uncertain and unpolished, is you. You need to give yourself permission to find sensitivity and curiosity and presence and those values beyond performance, and give yourself permission to exist imperfectly. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope that it made you think a little bit about the connectiveness of perception and validation. And I hope that it led you to think a little bit more about allowing yourself to exist imperfectly. I'll do a couple more episodes as we move through this podcast that dives into some of these ideas a little bit deeper. This was just sort of a foundation setting episode. And if this episode made you think about things, if it made you think of stories or ideas, feel free to write them in the comments so that other listeners can see them too. I would really appreciate if you would follow and rate this podcast. Any interaction really does help. If you're on Instagram and you would like to follow the podcast Instagram, it is darksideofperfect.pod. That is darksideofperfect, POD. I hope you're finding joy wherever you are today. I hope you're finding some whimsy wherever you are today, and I will see you next time.